Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of a podcast that I have yet to name, but this episode is called Under the Floorboards. We will be discussing Repression, folklore, and the novels Villette and Wuthering Heights, written respectively by Charlotte and Emily Bronte. Early 19th century England was a place filled with social anxiety. Disease was constant. Tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera moved invisibly through households, so death was not abstract to the peoples of 19th century England. As scholars like Brian Harrison will explain, religion shaped and structured daily life not only spiritually, but socially as well, creating rigid expectations around behavior, morality, and self-control. At the same time, folklore didn't just appear from nowhere because England was industrializing. According to K.M. Briggs, folk beliefs about ghosts, omens, spirits, and the supernatural continued to circulate alongside the rise of Christianity and Catholicism. These stories offered explanation for suffering when science failed and people were questioning why God was punishing them. But they also gave shape to fear. This matters because fear wasn't just something people felt, it was something they lived with. Authors like Mira Jaganathan and Jonathan Kucich both emphasize how Victorian culture trained individuals, especially women, to internalize emotion, discipline, and desire, and convert feeling into silence. Repression wasn't accidental, it was something that was productive, or at least the way they shaped it. It was created for the conditions for intense interior lives, and that interiority is where the Brontes write from. Now, it is widely known that Charlotte Bronte's life was marked by loss and absence. The early deaths of her mother Maria and sisters Maria and Elizabeth in the same year, just months apart, the isolation of Haworth, and the emotional closeness of her family shaped her deeply. Authors like Catherine Frank remind us that Charlotte was acutely aware of how her life would be interpreted, revised, and even romanticized after her death. But Charlotte wanted to be understood, not a myth. One of the most compelling ideas about Charlotte comes from author Peter Allen Dale, who argues that she possessed what he called a heretical desire for endlessness. Charlotte didn't want neat conclusions, emotionally, spiritually, or narratively. She resisted closure. The resistance shows up again and again and again in her novels, especially Villette, and this is where I started to feel really connected to her. Charlotte writes as someone who is constantly negotiating between what she feels and what she is allowed to express. She wants intensity, meaning, and recognition, but she knows those wants are dangerous. I relate to that tension, the pull between emotional depth and social restraint, between what you want and what society tells you that you should want, ambition and invisibility. But Charlotte doesn't like resolving that conflict. It seems like she finds comfort living inside of it. Villette is Charlotte's most inward novel, but also her most unsettling. Lucy Snow doesn't just narrate to confess. She narrates to control. Jaganathan describes this as an aesthetics of wounding, where repression itself becomes a narrative strategy. Lucy is not a romantic heroine in the traditional sense whatsoever. She refuses transparency and emotional accessibility, and in doing so, mirrors constantly Charlotte's own methods of survival. This aligns with the thoughts from author Kucich, whose broader argument that repression in Victorian fiction is not weakness but power. Charlotte embeds herself in Lucy not through autobiography, but through emotional architecture. The silences, the gaps, the refusal to clarify the ending, these are not accidents. Dale argues that Charlotte deliberately rejects narrative finality because this is something that she herself never received. The ending of Villette does not comfort us because Charlotte herself was unconvinced by comfort. And honestly, I feel that, girl. I love that Charlotte trusts her reader enough to leave them unsettled. And I think that is something very powerful when it comes to novels. Now, as previously discussed, we will be discussing Emily Bronte and Wuthering Heights. Specifically, how Charlotte seems to be the master of repression and emotional fragility, but Emily seems to be the opposite, but similar at the same time. I believe these sisters experienced a lot of the same emotions, yet had different ways of self expression. We don't know much about Emily, and that absence of personal information about her has allowed Wuthering Heights to take on a mythic, almost folkloric quality. Deborah Lutz's research on relics and death culture highlights how the novel treats bodies, memories, and grief as tangible forces, things that refuse to stay buried. One of the most famous examples is the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw, who appears to haunt both Heathcliff and the house itself. Her ghostly presence is not just a symbol, it actively shapes the actions and emotions of the living creatures, blurring the line between life and death. Unlike Villette, where repression governs the narrative, Wuthering Heights lets emotion and supernatural forces run wild, yet still has a structure that mirrors the obsessive intensity of its characters. This is where I believe is the most obvious example, personally, of how these sisters had the same experiences but just different ways of controlling them. Emily seemed to put all of her emotions on the paper and nothing seemed to be hidden. But with Charlotte, it seems like she has always, and assuming because she is the elder of the siblings that were still living at the time, had to hide how she felt. She was also taking care of her father at the same time. And I believe that that has shaped the self expression of these two sisters. Now, Emily's imagination seems to channel folklore directly into the story, making the ghost of Catherine both a literal and emotional force that deepens the novel's exploration of love, loss, and the persistence of memory. Charlotte Bronte seems to stand at the intersection of fear and restraint, folklore and faith, longing and denial. Scholars like Chin show how even Jane Eyre engages with ideas of monstrosity and difference, but Villette seems to strip that confrontation down to its core. Charlotte doesn't seem to be the type of person to ask questions like, "Am I monstrous?" but ask, "What happens if I were to never let myself speak?" And that question is still incredibly modern. Charlotte teaches us that repression isn't just something imposed, it's something internalized. And yet, through writing, she finds a way to speak without fully revealing herself. That balance between privacy and expression is something that I deeply admire and something that I still struggle with. The Brontes didn't write in isolation. They wrote from a world thick with fear, religious belief, illness, and silence. Charlotte, especially, transformed repression into art, not by escaping it, but mastering it. And maybe that's why her work still lingers, because she is a reminder that even when we hold back, we are still saying a lot. And that is my conclusion. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of this podcast. I have enjoyed my research for this podcast, actually a lot more than I thought I would. And I'm excited to potentially continue doing something like this. I've had a wonderful time in my Victorian literature class, and I'm so grateful to have experienced the opinions and interpretations of other people. And I love Dr. Gazaniga. She is a very sweet person, and this podcast is for her class, my final project. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you tune back in. Later releases coming soon.